Well, as you mentioned, one of the big things is climate emissions. The military is really heavily dependent on fossil fuels. So if you look at, and one of the reasons is that a lot of their equipment, particularly we're talking about jets, tanks, and so on, depend entirely on oil. So if you look at one of the biggest planes at the moment that the US uses, the B-52 Stratofortress, that uses as much oil in 1 hour as an average car driver would use in 7 years. So this is a really heavily fossil fuel dependent military that we have. And that's why they talk about it not as a carbon footprint, but a carbon boot print. And in terms of also, if you look at the infrastructure that exists for the military, and particularly the world's largest military, the US military, it extends right around the world. So you have 800 bases that cause this huge infrastructure of carbon emissions. And that's what made the Pentagon the single largest organizational producer of carbon emissions in the world. And it's not just limited to the US. A recent report just looked at the EU's carbon emissions, the carbon footprint, and calculated that in 2019, it was 24.8 million tons of carbon dioxide was produced by the military within the EU, which is equivalent to the carbon emissions of about 14 million car drivers. So you can see that the military has an outsized impact on climate. So that's one dimension of it, is the carbon emissions. We also know that over time, and this has been true for a long time, that the military also has a very heavy impact in terms of environmental contamination. We only need to go back towards the Second World War and the huge impact of the nuclear bomb drops in Japan, which had huge health and environmental impacts. The use of napalm in Cambodia and Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and the massive impacts that still unfold in terms of health and environmental impacts in the forests there. And it means that if you actually go to most military bases now, they are highly contaminated sites. Ones that they closed down here in the US, they often can't use for a long time because of the amount of environmental contamination involved in producing munitions, weapons, and so on. And then the last dimension I would draw out is looking at really the purpose of the military today. And we've got to understand that the military is very much bound up with a fossil fuel economy. The military was built up to sustain economic dominance, which really after the Second World War and before that was about control, ensuring you had cheap fuel for the economy and a smooth supply of supply lines. And both of those have led to a huge expansion of an oil-based economy, and also a huge expansion of a consumerist economy based on cheap goods produced on low wages and shipped cheaply to the rest of the world. So you can really see, and both of those are really ground up in what has led to a climate crisis, the overuse of oil and the overconsumption. And so really fossil fuel and militarism is really embedded together. Those things cannot be disconnected. Absolutely. I mean, one of the things about the military is that they have to make plans for how the world will be, not just now, but also in 10 years. And so they do what are called wargaming scenarios to say, what are the kind of threats we will face in the future? And so then, unlike some of the far right, they're not people who are climate. You won't find many climate deniers in high ranks of the military. They know climate change is happening, and they're preparing for it. So a lot of their preparations around how do we, there was actually a UK just put a defense document out just a few weeks ago, which says, how can the UK adapt, fight, and win in ever more hostile and unforgiving physical environments? So that's the kind of thing that you'll see happening in lots of different militaries. But what they're really, and what it's led to, is that they're trying to also reduce their own emissions and really their dependence on oil in certain circumstances, and also make themselves more able to fight in really kind of hot temperatures and things like that, and coping with sea level rise for bases. One of the things that the military is really concerned about is the vulnerability that oil gives. So if you look at Afghanistan and Iraq, a lot of the attacks on the troops that were occupying those countries was actually came from the fact that they were dependent on oil. So the first things that were attacked were oil convoys. And General Mattis, who later became Secretary of Defense under Trump, talked about this tether of oil. It basically made their troops vulnerable because those oil convoys could be stopped, and that could affect their occupation. But more generally, they're looking at their bases. There's a big base in Virginia, which controls a huge amount of the US military worldwide, and yet is suffering extreme storms every year, which are flooding the bases. There are troops, the French troops who are in Mali are really concerned about the temperatures that can even melt equipment that they're using. So what underlying all of this, and sometimes that leads them to do these kind of green things like put solar panels on bases, and everyone says that's great. But underlying it really is not a desire to be environmentally green so much as to be able to be resilient and to have the capacity to fight. That's the underlying thing. And beyond that, they're also looking at the kind of scenarios of the potential threats. And what they predict is that as temperatures rise, as extreme storms spread, as this will create social instability. It will lead to the rise of terrorism, it will lead to the rise of conflicts, and therefore the military needs to be able to respond. And that's very much how they do it. And I think what's important to understand about all these strategies is that they come from the perspective of the military. And the military's perspective is not about how to protect the most vulnerable or how to support climate adaptation for the poorest people. It's about how to secure the countries who already have the most resources. In the end, we're talking about security for the rich, for those who already have wealth. And often the strategies they will adopt will actually further undermine those who are most impacted by climate change. Well, that's true. I mean, what we have right now is a huge investment in the military, and particularly in security policies. So one of the parts of the states that is most developed right now, and this is particularly true of the US, but it's true of many of the rich industrialized nations, is that huge investments are made in military and security infrastructure, and yet there are constant cutbacks in terms of areas like social spending and so on. What doesn't get cut back very rarely is military or security spending. So that the US at the moment has such a big military that it spends more than the following 8 countries. They say of the kind of disposable parts of the US budget that is decided each year, about almost 50% of it gets directed towards the military. And that is money that could be redirected elsewhere, of course. We know that right now there's a big push to say that we have a very short window of action in terms of climate action, that we really need to do but huge investment in transitioning our entire economies. And if money is being wasted on military solutions, which are really about responding to crises rather than dealing with the underlying causes, then that's money not well spent. Really, now is a time to redivert money from military use towards the real things, the real security needs that we have, which is to address the climate crisis, to tackle its underlying causes, and to make the transition before it's too late. Yeah, I think it's a real shame at the moment. I would say partly the reason is we have a kind of siloization of politics. People stick to their particular issues. So environmentalists think climate change is just about environmental issues. People in peaceful movements think wars are just about are just something for peace activists. And there's this failure to make these connections. And yet they're really deeply embedded. I mean, if you look at, someone's calculated that since 1973, between a quarter to a half of all the wars that have happened have been linked to oil. So we cannot divorce these things. Environmentalists have to consider peace issues because climate change is leading to impacts on peace and security, because many of the wars are tied to fossil fuels. So you cannot kind of divorce these issues. And there really needs to be a greater kind of integration of it. So I think that's one of the things that has to happen, is this kind of connection between the issues. I think there's also a bit of naivety that comes sometimes from the movements about whose interests they serve. And that's been my real concern, is that because the military is one of the groups and it's a powerful group that takes climate change seriously, people think that their agenda is the same as a people's agenda. So you've had, for example, in the Netherlands, the Extinction Rebellion invited a Dutch general to contribute to their rebel handbook, because the Dutch general talked about environmentalism. And yet, for a military perspective, is very different from a perspective of climate justice. And so there's a real danger when we sort of naively invite people into the room without thinking about who their agenda and their interests are. And I think also the larger context is that there's been a normalization of military. There's never really been a public debate since the end of the Cold War about what the purpose of the military is. And what we've seen is an emerging number of threats. First, the big threat was around, you had the war on drugs, you've had this war on issues, we've had the war on terrorism. And yet, how can you engage a war on something as abstract as terror? There's never been real debate about about the militarization that's happened. Military budgets and military arms spending has almost doubled since the end of the Cold War, and no one really sits back and says, what's the purpose of this, and is it serving what we need at a time of climate crisis? Well, I think that needs a big debate. I mean, I come from it from a kind of abolitionist perspective, like whose interests does the military serve the vast majority of the time? And I think the evidence is clear that the main interests that the military serve are the arms companies, who sell more and more of their weapons, the paramilitary groups who are now kind of contracted for deployment in places like Iraq, and the corporations whose interests they serve. I mean, many of the wars we see today are about guaranteeing access to strategic resources, which is also accelerating the climate crisis. So I think there needs to be a big debate about the purpose of the military, because at the moment it's serving interests which are fundamentally opposed to a climate justice agenda. And even when they do good things, for example, humanitarian aid, I think it's firstly important to say that this is a really tiny percentage of their actual deployment, and sometimes it's for ulterior motives, and sometimes it actually distorts an agenda. So what you saw with the military being involved, the US military being involved in aid in Iraq and in Afghanistan, is it actually distorted humanitarianism, because humanitarianism is meant to be a neutral, objective, helping anyone regardless of political and military goals. But the US military was very much there about justifying occupation, and therefore it meant that that they started to be targets of attacks. And then you had people from organizations like the Red Cross also being identified with the US military. So actually you end up, even if the military does something good, it ends up distorting it in such a way that it affects others working in the sector. It's also very expensive. So is there ways that we could deliver the kind of infrastructural support that the military provides without using a body such as the military? So I think we need a real debate. I'm not saying that there is no reason for any kind of armed defense, but we need to start to open up that debate about whose interests are served, what real security looks like. And I think we know that most people's security is around having a safe place to live, having a home, having a social infrastructure, and being able to support each other in times of crisis. And there are very different models for approaching that. And what's so problematic for me is that we just normalize the military as being the last point of defense without looking at other infrastructures that could actually be much more effective and much more aligned up with the goals of the vast majority rather than the small few. Well, what you've seen, because I mean, I mentioned already that there is a huge amount of money that is diverted into defense and military. And this has created what was coined the military-industrial complex. It was Eisenhower. He was actually a general in the Second World War, and yet he saw how basically this complex of interests had come together. One of people within the military, politicians who invested in supporting the military, and also the arms companies themselves, who's all had a very strong interest to keep increasing the budgets, increasing the amount of spending, and who had a very strong position within countries to kind of keep that spiral of spending going upwards and so on, and really defending any attempts to kind of cut back or rethink it and so on. So it's created something that exists certainly in the US, but exists elsewhere, where really there's a very entrenched body of power, block of interests, that is very hard to shift. And we see it also in the European Union, not just in terms of military. I would say that there's now really a military security industrial complex. I've been working a lot on the issue of borders, and what we see is that there are arms companies who are getting European money for research, who then research to show that there are threats that need money and investments. So they create the research to justify more spending, and then they increase the budgets, and then they provide the products that will respond to that. And then they identify new security threats. So it becomes a kind of constantly upward cycling, a cycle of influence, power, and money. And we see it so clearly in what the results. So if you look at the world of borders, Frontex, which is the main border security force now for the European Union, had 5 million euros in 2005. And as a result of this influence of security companies and their influence over the European Commission, their budget is now increased just 15 years later to 460 million. That's a 9,000% increase in terms of, and there's no sign that will decrease at any point soon. In fact, they're planning to expand it even massively more. So you create this atmosphere of fear, and the only solution is security, and the only way to do that is to increase budgets for the arms and security companies. So it becomes a kind of self-perpetuating cycle of fear, security, and money. And that's something that we really need to break. And it's created this control over the discourse, so that it's not even really discussed or openly discussed, as even in movements such as environmental movements. And so really we need to start to kind of question and open up some of these discussions and debates, and really look at the purpose and the reasons for these institutions and whose interests they're serving. I'm very limited. Like I said, there's a lot of if it's on the climate denying side, they don't talk about it at all. But even on the side of kind of pro-environmental voices, it's generally seen that it's a positive thing that the military are taking climate change seriously. And it's praised that they're investing in solar power, for example, but really without looking at the real reasons why they're doing that and whose interests they serve. So there's very little coverage of it, and where it is, it's not really looked at in a kind of critical or thoughtful way. So I think that's something that really needs to be opened up much more. Yeah, the consequence is that it keeps growing, this and the complex, and I think what happens is, my concern is that really underlying all of this is that we are going to be facing some really significant impacts from, and we're already seeing that in terms of climate change. You know, I live in California. I couldn't even go out of my house for several weeks because of the wildfire smoke. And the military served no purpose there. It didn't protect me in any way. Many people in the poorest countries are being flooded, facing extreme weather, and what happens is that they then become forced to move, and a military solution to that actually makes their situation even worse. So militarized responses to social disruption often make the victims of climate change even more victims. It kind of increases the impact. Not only are they had nothing to do with causing climate change, they're now facing its impacts, and when they try to just survive, they face militarized solutions. And you see that particularly on the European borders right now. The more and more people are trying to flee from situations which are impossible to live in, and yet they face a very militarized response on the borders. Or very, very dangerous journeys. And so what happens is that we're not really tackling the underlying causes of climate change and its impacts in a way that will actually address the problem. Instead, we're militarizing the solutions. Well, I think there's a few things. I think first would be to start with some basic investigation and research. Find out what the carbon blueprint of your military is, of the arms industry is, and how that can be reduced dramatically. We have a short window for action, but I think what should be careful about in that process is that the idea isn't to green the military, but it's actually to shrink the military, because a green military really is a smaller military. It's not one that says that continues with the same infrastructure and support, but just with a few solar panels added. So really ask a role about the military and its role in climate change, and do some of the research there. I think a second thing is to open up the debate, as we've done in this conversation. Whenever you hear the word military, or particularly nowadays security and climate change, because you'll always hear these things together, that we need to look at the security implications of climate change. I think you should just ask a basic question about whose security are they talking about? And if you start to ask that question, it opens up really the purposes of some of the strategies that we see unfolding. And if it's not the purposes of those who are most vulnerable to climate change, which should be our priority, like how do we protect the security of those most impacted by climate change, then it's the wrong strategy. So that's one thing, a second thing I would encourage. And the third thing links back, I guess, to the conversation we just had a bit earlier about breaking down the silos. If you're an environmental activist, then reach out to the people involved in anti-arms trade campaigning, to the peace groups. Similarly, if you're in a peace group, reach out to the environmental campaigners. Let's make these connections clearer, because we are moving into a more militarized, securitized world. And unless our movements start to link together, we won't be able to take on this powerful nexus of interests that we've talked about. Yeah, I brought together with some colleagues a whole group of people to look at the whole issue of what we saw as this rise of the word security and security responses to climate change. And we saw that both through a military lens, in the sense of there were military strategies talking about how to build security in a climate changed world, but also corporations. How do they ensure the security of their operations? Because really the two most powerful forces really in the world today are transnational corporations through their sheer economic power, and the military, which has become strengthened, and the security forces, which have been strengthened not just in typical authoritarian states, but across liberal democracies as well. So they're the ones who are already making plans for climate change. So we wanted to look at their long-term plans. And that's really where we started to became clear that their plans were very much about securing those who already have wealth. But in the process, they would often undermine those who are the most vulnerable to climate change and who will suffer its largest impacts. So that's where we started to kind of open up the discussion, and we saw that this was affecting areas such as water, where there is huge speculation, for example, going on in terms of water markets, where corporations are buying up rights to water and speculating with these, and that would undermine people's rights to water for survival. And we saw it also in terms of military plans, which were very much about securing the wealth of the US, for example, against sea level rise, against disruption of shipping lanes, but again, not with an eye view of the security of the many. So that was what the book was about. And in some ways, it's really, we wrote that in 2015. It's become even more clear. And I think particularly in the area of borders and migration, we're seeing a really militarized response from many of the richest countries, a huge investment in the militarization of borders, and ones that are expanding. So the European Union, for example, is now collaborating with a lot of authoritarian governments in North Africa to ensure that migrants never even get near the European borders. And yet we know that as climate crisis unfolds, more and more people will be forced to migrate. So is our response to just stop and lead people to either die or to be killed? Or can we find other ways to ensure our collective security? And I think those are the kind of fundamental questions we face right now is what kind of world do we want to live in a time of climate crisis? And we know that really that the best way to ensure security is a collective, where we stand together. We've seen that so clearly in the pandemic. When countries just support themselves, they're not controlling the pandemic, because one person's injury, one person's becoming sick has a potential impact on all of us. And really the pandemic should be a moment to realize that our collective security depends on a collective response, not an individualized or nationalistic response. So I think in some ways, the questions we asked back in 2015 have become even sharper and clearer as here we are in 2021.